Scott, do you want to talk about your book and why you wrote this book and why did you pick the name?
Sure. Well, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, it's a book that is about the story of non-human entities that descended to the earth and impregnated or intermingled with human women and had children by them. And the source point of the word Nephilim is the Hebrew Old Testament, the book of Genesis. And it is a story that's found in the book of Genesis. And you find it in 600 different cultures across all of the ancient world. They've all got similar stories that talk about similar beings. And so it was really started as a study into the theological story of the Nephilim as told in the book of Genesis.
Can you, before we talk about that, can we go into your history on, before you wrote this book, what brought you to write this book? So tell us about your history.
Good question.
Okay, a little bit of my history. I got my start in Bible college and seminary, and I was going into ministry, and I was in a very conservative fundamentalist Baptist setting. And so a very conservative evangelical type of setting. Even the term evangelical was almost anathema where we were, because evangelical you start to get into liberal theology. And so we were very conservative, and we were your born again Christians. That was the mode of belief that we had, and everything was based on the Bible. And it was supposed to be the Bible was our one foundation for faith and practice, and that was it. And so I went through my high school days in the youth group and in the church school. And then I went into Bible college, as I said, and seminary, and went into youth ministry. And all through that, I had questions about certain things as I was going along the way. And I would ask those questions and not get what I felt was satisfactory or even genuine answers. I didn't feel that anybody was really interested in finding the core of the answer to the questions. And they were simple things about the names of God found in the Old Testament. And the story of the Nephilim was one of the questions that I had. Because now, if I ask you if you know about the story of Noah and the ark, or if you went to church or synagogue, or if you were in Sunday school as a kid, did you learn about Noah and the ark? Most people will know something about that story.
Right.
And even those who have gone to church and are immured in a certain church doctrine can tell you the story of Noah and the ark. But how many of those people know that the story of the Nephilim is part of the ark story, the Noah and the ark story? It's the preamble, the prelude to the story. And it says in Genesis chapter 6, the source point of the word Nephilim, by the way. And it says in that chapter, it says, and in those days, the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. They were known as the Nephilim, the heroes of old and the men of renown. And that's about all it says about it. It's almost a scant mention in the book of Genesis. And so you get to start going to outside sources to finding more about it. I went to the apocryphal book of Enoch, which takes the same account as you find in Genesis, same exact verbiage, only expands it into chapter after chapter after chapter. Well, actually, they didn't take and expand it in the book of Enoch. I think it was the other way around. I believe Moses, who no reason to doubt his historicity, I believe he wrote the account of the Nephilim based on what he read in the ancient book of Enoch. And so he is pulling some of his information from that extant source. And so this is the source point, and it's a study of beings who came down. And who were these beings? Who were these sons of God? Why are they mentioned? Why are they never linked to the flood story, which is where they're found at the beginning of the flood story? And so I had questions like that, and I would get insufficient answers. It would seem to me like the answers were a stretch to try to fit into doctrinal dogma, as opposed to really look for answers. When I asked about one of the systematic theology professors at my seminary, and I asked him, who are these characters, these sons of God that came down and interbred with human women? Who are these guys? It calls them, in the Hebrew text, it says that these sons of God, which is how we say it in the English, and the Hebrew they're called the Bene Ha-Elohim. And they came and intermingled with the daughters of Adam, the daughters of men. And so I asked, who are these characters? I was told, well, they're nothing supernatural. Of course, we know that. It's really just the sons of the men who ran the school of the prophets up on the hillside, and that they saw the daughters of the common folk down in the valley, and they went down and intermingled with them. And I said, but it doesn't say that in the text. And why, in such a logical language as Hebrew, why is it not spelling out for me that they are the same kinds of beings rather than telling me there's a contrast? There's a stark contrast. The sons of Elohim versus the daughters of Adam. Now that's your one source point for the story. There are other source points for finding out who these beings are. There's other source points in what I believe is Hebrew scripture, even though it was removed from the canon of scripture under Constantine's councils in the 300s. And I also believe that there are external sources. When you start looking at the multiplicity of cultures that have similar stories and have common threads running to them, only using different names, different name places, different events, you have this huge story that you will find exists. And all it really tells you is that something huge happened in mankind's ancient past. And all these different cultures, all these different religions had their own version of the story.
Wow.
So can you tell us why God picked Noah? Why did he think Noah was such a great man or such a good man compared to anybody else?
Well, I don't think, now when you read it in the English, you will find that it says Noah was a righteous man and this is why he was chosen. And that's the story that we learned. If you tell the story of Noah and the ark, you can tell it in 8 seconds. God was really pissed off over the wickedness of mankind, so he was going to wipe out the whole earth with a great flood, and he chose one righteous man, Noah, and his family, and they built the ark. And of course, God brings the animals to the ark. That, by the way, whether you believe the story or not, one of the misnomers about the story is Noah had to go out there with a lasso and a net rounding up 2 of every animal. It does say this was a miraculous event in the book of Genesis, and that all Noah did was build the ark and go inside, and God brought the animals to the ark, as the story goes. But there is something very interesting in the Hebrew, that where it says that God chose Noah because he was the only righteous man. That's the way we read it in the English. It actually says he chose Noah because he was the only pure-blooded man, and that he was pure-blooded in all his generations, going back to Adam. And this is of great importance. Even when we read about the flood story and we saw the phrase in English that said that Noah was pure in all his generations, I never quite knew what that meant until I understood what the story was behind the whole thing. You have to really just step outside of the Hebrew story. If you're a Christian or if you're a Jew and you believe these things and this is your book of faith, this is what I came out of as well, and I still haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater, I like to say, but at the same time, I don't want to offend anybody's religious sensibilities or asking you to change your faith on anything, but sometimes you have to look at these stories and step back from them for a minute and say, okay, wait a minute, I've got this story, I need to step back and look at it from the outside and see what the whole picture is. And what you will find is that this story of the Nephilim is so huge and so widespread that it is the entirety of the Old Testament that covers what happens because of the Nephilim. And it's almost like this. It's like if you had a timeline in front of you and you had the Ark and Noah here with the Nephilim story, you have to go way out thousands of years later to the book of Psalms to understand who these characters were, these sons of God who came down. And then you've got to go all the way back way before Noah to the Genesis story of Adam and Eve in the garden and the serpent in the garden to understand the ramifications of why the flood came about and why Noah was told that, why we're told that Noah was a man who was pure in all his generations. It all links together and becomes this huge story that takes all this effort to start looking at from the outside. And then once you've done that, you got to step outside the Judeo-Christian box and look at the fact that this same story is told, as I mentioned earlier, over 600 times in ancient culture, ancient religions, ancient tribal cultures. And common to all these other cultures are stories of non-human or spirit entities that descend to the earth, that impregnate women, bequeath a race that some divinity or higher power is really angry about, and they're going to wipe everything out with a great flood. And yet it's different casts of characters, different names, different people. Same thing with the creation story. When you start linking these characters together with what's going on in the creation story, you're going to see even a bigger picture emerge. And then you start looking at all the other cultures' creation stories and how all these things start to link together. You have to step way back and take a deep breath.
I think it's really, your book really jars people, you know, out of what they've been taught. I mean, it's a jarring experience to read your book. And I'm not a religious person, I'm more of a spiritual, so I'm open to new ideas. But this was, it even for me, being so open was kind of hard to really embrace. I wanted to, and I'm still kind of, you know, trying to sort it all through. But you know, the way you started the book with the biblical part, and then you go into this other part, which is not at all what the Bible has said, which is these were angels that fell from heaven.
Well, now, and that's a misnomer as well. The whole idea that these beings were angels who came down, the fallen angels came down and interbred with humans.
Right.
That has been the accepted train of thought for centuries on this. The only problem is that the word for angel is never used for them in any of the original Hebrew texts. And by original, I mean, we obviously have copies of some of these manuscripts. But as far back as you can go, the word for angel, meleka, is never used in any of these texts. It's not talking about angels. It's talking about a different kind of being. And when they're called in the book of Genesis, the Bene Ha-Elohim, the sons of Elohim, you have to get an understanding of who Elohim was, and then an understanding of who the Elohim were, plural, because it's this. Now, this will take us to one of the first big questions I had when I was in my seminary days, amongst many, and that was the name for God. If you look at the Old Testament, there's many, many, many names used for God in the Old Testament, from the angel of the Lord to El Shaddai, to Elohim, to El Elyon, to Jehovah, all these different names that are used for God, and many of them. The one used the most in the Old Testament was the word Elohim, and it was used almost 3,000 times in the Old Testament. Now, Elohim, by definition, means this. El is the base name for God, E-L, and Him, just like in the word Nephilim, that Him is a plural suffix that's tacked on in the Hebrew language to denote plurality. And so, like with Nephilim, the base word Nephal means to fall, to come down, to leave one's estate and go to another. Im, added on the end, the Him suffix just denotes plurality. Those who fell, those who came down, those who left their estate. Same thing with Elohim. Elohim simply means, by definition, God of or God among many gods. Now, the word Elohim can be used plurally or singularly, depending on the context of the passage around it. And this is with any of this stuff. When you start looking into ancient texts, ancient religious texts, ancient historical religious texts, you have to determine a few things while you're doing it. Number one, what language was it written in, and what does that mean for the context of the passage? To whom was the passage being written, and what would their understanding have been of what was being said in the passage? So it's all about context, context, context. It's kind of like the arguments we see in the United States about the Constitution, and like Second Amendment arguments, owning guns, and so on. One political party will believe this, the other will believe that. One will say, I believe it's interpretable by modern language. The other will say you have to go back to intent of how it was written. That's exactly what we've got here in these old texts. You have to go back to the intent of what was said. They weren't writing to a future audience. And so when you get to Elohim, Elohim by definition means God among many gods, or God of many gods. And if it can be singular and plural, it's a lot like our word deer in the English language. I can look out my window and see a singular deer in my front yard, or look out my back patio and see a herd of deer, plural, out in my pasture. So it's the same way with the word Elohim.
So can you explain, because most people, most religious people believe there is one God. There are talks of gods, the Greek mythology gods, but so what does that mean, God of many gods?
Well, I'll tell you this, and this is where I step on a big branch here.
Yay!
And I don't want to offend anybody's religious sensibilities, and again, trust me, I still struggle with some of the things I find in the tendrils of the old stuff I was raised in. When I say I haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater, I mean that. I still adhere to certain tenets of my faith, but I have big questions, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
So do you believe in a God?
I believe the Bible does not teach monotheism the way it is taught in Judaism and in Christianity. Now, who am I? One guy out here that says, hey, all of you Jews and Christians over the last couple thousand years, you're all wrong. You know, listen to what I say. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm not the lone voice on this either. And that's where I like to say, my book is not exhaustive by any means, nor is it all original. This stuff has been written about many, many times. I've just restructured it in a different way and put my own twist and my own belief system on it of what I have determined by way of research. So when I say that I believe the Bible does not teach monotheism, it's not a new thought.
Okay, so wait. We've got monotheism is the belief in one God.
The belief in one God.
Thank you. Okay, so you don't believe in one God.
I am beginning to not believe that there is one God, and I am convinced that the Bible doesn't teach there is one God.
Okay.
It teaches that there might be a supreme God. But I want you to go, well, you don't have to pick up your Bible and turn there, but if you get a chance, look at Psalm 82. You and your listeners, Psalm 82, and it's got God addressing a group known as the Divine Council. And this group is a little obscure in Scripture. I didn't even learn a lot about the Divine Council. So all through Bible college and seminary, I never heard of them. And you've got God talking to them, and He's passing judgment on them for something, but it doesn't tell you what. But here's how the passage reads. Now keep in mind the word Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
It says there, when it talks about God, interchange the word Elohim in the Hebrew. It says, and Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim. So Elohim, singular, stood in the midst of the Elohim, plural. And He, singular, said to them, plural, you are all Elohim. You are the bright, shining princes of heaven. And then He goes on to tell them, but I could strip your immortality from you and you will die like men. And He passes judgment on them for something. And I believe this is judgment being passed on the members of the Divine Council who descended to the earth and impregnated human women. They are known as, in this Psalm 82, they're known as the Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven. Now, I want you to think of the Nephilim story, think of this Psalm story, go all the way back now to the beginning. Let's go to the Garden of Eden for a second. And we all know the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the garden. And according to, whether you believe this is actual fact, or whether you believe it's allegorical tale, or if you believe it's just it's religious mythology, no matter which way you want to look at it, this is the Hebrew story of creation. And it coincides with many other accounts throughout other religions of first families in creation and the details that took place. Now, the story we know is the fall of mankind. It happened because the serpent came in, tempted Eve. She took a forbidden fruit, gave it to her husband Adam. He took of the fruit. Poof, all of a sudden they're naked, according to the text. I always wondered, what was the first result or consequence of the fall of mankind? Nakedness. And I wondered about that. I would ask those questions. And it's because of what you find happens in this text and what the real context of the whole passage is all about. And I believe this is setting the stage for the whole story of the Old Testament. So what you have here is the serpent character. Now, let me give you guys a pop quiz. Who were we taught was the serpent in the garden?
Lucifer, Satan.
Lucifer, Satan. Now, did you know that in the Hebrew text, The word for Lucifer, the word for Satan, the word for devil never appears in the Hebrew text. That's attributed thousands of years later by later writers. What you've got in the Genesis text of the Garden of Eden, the serpent character is called Nakash in the Hebrew. Nakash. And Nakash, by definition, means this. It means crafty magician, trickster, the bringer of knowledge, the illuminator. Get this, remember Psalm 82? The bright shining one. Now, whoever the character was in the Garden of Eden, I believe by all the content, and this is, by the way, this whole talk tonight is Nephilim light. And I'm just stringing the facts together for you as I found them. Nakash, the serpent character in the Garden of Eden, is none other than a member of the divine council. And the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, are none other than the Elohim, the members of the divine council, the bright shining ones. Now, before I go any further with either of these stories, I just want to bring up one example outside of Scripture, and where I say these creatures exist in all these different mythologies and cultures. I'm going to pick my favorite one. I'm Scottish and Welsh by heritage, so I'm very much into my Celtic heritage. And I loved the Celtic version of this story, and I'd heard about it for years and never connected it to the Nephilim story until I started researching it. In the ancient Iberian Peninsula, the ancient Celts had a legend of, or a mythology of their gods. It was the Tuatha De Danann, the children of the goddess Danu. They were referred to as the bright shining kings from heaven, who descended to the earth, taught forbidden knowledges to mankind, impregnated human women. They receded in importance and became known as the elven folk in the Hollow Hills. And this is one of the neatest stories because it's so close to things that I enjoy and read about. You look at J.R.R. Tolkien's writings of the Lord of the Rings series, and you've got a guy who had his finger on the pulse of all these ancient religious mysteries and mythologies. So that's one example outside, but many of these examples of these beings who came down and interacted with ancient humans are known as bright shining characters. There also have reptilian references to them, some amphibian references to them. Half man, half snake, half man, half fish, things like that. But common to all of them is this teaching of forbidden knowledge and the impregnating or interbreeding with the human race. So go back to the Genesis story of Adam and Eve now. Nakash, being one of these members of the divine council, the bright shining one of the bright shining princes of heaven, one of the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, the whole story of the Garden of Eden is not about forbidden fruit. That is just the way we use it today. Beware the forbidden fruit of life. What happened in the Garden of Eden was a story that all contextually was sexual in nature.
Wow.
And the whole interaction between Eve and the serpent in the garden, Nakash, whether you believe the story is literal or not, the creation story is about sexual contact and sexual intercourse. And Eve has intercourse with Nakash. The same thing the sons of God do with human women later before the flood story starts. And there's an impregnation. And she bears a son named Cain, one of twin sons. Adam, she also brings into this mix with Nakash and says, look at this great thing Nakash has shown me. And she introduces it to Adam, and he also impregnates her. She bears the twin sons, Cain and Abel. Now, the twin sons are Cain and Abel, but they're representing dual bloodlines. One is the son of Nakash, one is the son of Adam. Now, I don't just suck this out of my thumb. This is all established in the context of these passages and the context of the things that happened following in the Old Testament. What you have here, first look at the other mythologies. Many of the first family creation first families had a trickster character of some sort that came in and either impregnated the wife of the first couple or a daughter of the first couple, and they always bore multiples, either twins or triplets or quadruplets. The Hebrew story in the book of Genesis is no different. Adam and Eve bore twins, Adam being the father of Abel and Nakash being the father of Cain. Now, right after this all happens, remember in the story you've got God who comes down to the garden And this sounds like such mythology when it's told this way, but it says right in the Bible that God came down to walk in the garden in the cool of the day. And he calls out for Adam. And there's no answer. And he calls again. And Adam finally answers, "We're hiding." And God says, "Well, why are you hiding?" Adam said, "Because we were naked." And God said, "Who told you you were naked?" And Adam, right away the blame game starts. Adam's like, "Well, the woman, she gave me this thing." And the woman's like, "Well, the snake, he gave me the," you get the whole blame thing starting. And God comes down and curses everybody as a result. Now, in this cursing that takes place right there at the beginning, you've got God saying two very significant things. And one, first of all, is the first messianic prophecy of the coming Messiah was uttered in the Garden of Eden at the fall of mankind. And you ask any rabbinic scholar or any Christian scholar to ask you where the first messianic prophecy took place, and they're going to tell you it took place right there in the Garden of Eden. That's where God looks at the serpent and he says, "Someday you will attempt to crush or to bruise his heel, and you'll accomplish that, but he will in turn crush your head." That's a messianic prophecy. Now, in the Jewish mindset, or the Hebrew mindset, Messiah stood for a phrase that was known as the kinsman redeemer. If you've ever been in a church at Christmas time or Easter time, you will hear talk of Jesus Christ being one of us. He was born one of us. He was all mankind, and yet he was God. And it's been watered down over the ages to that, but the original message was kinsman redeemer. And I always wondered, what was the significance? Why did the Hebrews have to have a redeemer? And why did that redeemer have to be a kinsman of pure human blood? And then it struck me as I studied all these things, the need for the story of the Messiah being of pure human kinsman redeemer blood, the need for that story was not to establish so much the Messiah as to establish the fact that there was a pure bloodline and a tainted bloodline, if you will. And all the genealogies in the Old Testament, if you ever read the Old Testament, you find chapter after chapter after chapter, these boring genealogies. Lamech begat Shemka, and Shemka begat Lamesh, and Lamesh lay with 3 women and bore 4 sons and begat. You have all this going on for chapter after chapter. And I always wondered, what's the need for these genealogies? Why are they here? The genealogies were there to establish the pure bloodline of the humans and to establish the line of the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer. And it's almost like they're ignoring the other bloodline, but the reason it's there is because they're showing the contrast to the bloodline of Cain or the bloodline of Nephilim. And the second thing that happened in the Garden of Eden after God gives the messianic prophecy, God says this to them all. He says, "And there shall be constant enmity or conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, or the seed of humans. And this will carry through all time." And this enmity is between the dual seed that has been produced here now in Eve's womb. And another thing you can look at, when you finally get up to the Nephilim story, the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And it goes right into the Noah and the Ark story. And it says, "And God chose Noah because he was the only pure-blooded family left. And he was pure in all his generations." That's when it starts to make sense back to the Edenic story. Then you come all the way ahead now. Jump up to King David in the Old Testament, thousands of years later. They are establishing his link to Adam as being part of the pure bloodline. Because after the time of David, the prophecies of the Messiah turned into not only the ones that already existed, but they added on to that, and the Messiah will spring from the seed of David, the king, and will be the rightful heir to the throne of David. And so when you hear, again, Jesus being talked about as the line of David, and you go to the New Testament, and they take Jesus' followers, take Mary, the mother of Jesus, and trace her lineage all the way back to David, establishing that she, therefore her son, the Messiah, is of pure human blood that goes back from David all the way to Adam again. But they don't trace the bloodline through the eldest son, Cain. Why? That's breaking tradition. Why did they break tradition and not trace it through Cain? Because Cain, the eldest, was not of pure human blood. they trace it through the lesser, through Seth, the third son, or through Abel, the second son. And because the first son was not pure human. So whatever happened in the human race in ancient times happened from the get-go. And I'm going to say it this way, and again, not to offend anybody's religious sensibilities, but when you step back and you start looking at all the other stories that exist out there, and if we've got time, I'll tell you one that dates back a little further that actually establishes the Genesis story, and that's the story of the Sumerians and the Anunnaki. But what you can see and recognize right away is that there was a big event that happened, and perhaps the Genesis account and the Hebrew version is just that. It may not be the corner on the absolute truth, it may be the version by the Hebrews of what took place. Just like the Celts had their Tuatha De Danann, just like the Sumerians had their Anunnaki, just like the Mayans had Quetzalcoatl, just like you have the ancient Far East has its dragons, the Hindu culture has Krishna, who sat beneath a banyan tree on a coiled serpent and disseminated forbidden knowledges to humans and was executed by the other gods for it. All these stories start to look alike.
Well, okay. I'm sorry. Wow, it's all in my head. So when you, okay, so I just want to get a really just kind of really tight little, making sure that everybody's following. You're saying that the serpent was not a serpent, as everybody believes, that this was a being from above.
He was part of the divine council.
Divine council.
One of the bright shining ones.
Right, that came, and so Adam and Eve had never had sex before then, is the big revelation. She was a virgin, and they had no knowledge of this.
Right. So
he came, this serpent, and can you say again what?
Nakash.
Nakash, thank you. The Nakash, and being a crafty magician, a bright shiny one, came and taught her what sex was, or showed her that knowledge. Demonstrated. And then she went to Adam and said, look what I learned.
Right.
And they got it together, and then from there came Cain and Abel.
Right.
One of pure human blood and one of some other kind of blood.
The mixed blood of the Elohim.
Right. Wow. Oh my gosh.
And now get this. If you read even in the English version of this, you will notice in that Genesis story of Adam and Eve, after the fall, you've got God speaking. And God says, the humans have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let us, plural, go down and prevent them from also eating of the tree of life, lest they become like us, like gods.
Mm.
Now, what's very interesting about that is a reestablishment of the multiple nature of Elohim. That he was not just a single character, that it was it was not a monotheistic God, it was a pantheon of gods. At the same time, and by the way, where people bring up the argument that this is just the Trinity, keep in mind the Hebrews didn't have a Trinity. So this is not the Trinity, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right.
The Son did not exist at this point, unless you consider him, as the Christians will say, the pre-incarnate Christ.
Now, I want to ask a real question before we go on. So you said God of many gods. You had talked about that there was the one God that was then condemning the other gods who fell to earth. So are we then saying that there is one main God and then there are other higher beings that consider themselves gods as well?
It looks awful lot like the Greek pantheon. Think of Zeus and the other gods.
Okay.
Zeus could obviously, in the mythologies, could be overthrown, meaning he was the god of gods. He was the god of them. He was their boss, their king. But he also had to keep thwarting attempts to overthrow his status.
Okay.
Now, I think this is a way to look at Elohim, is that he is the God of gods. He is the king of the gods. He is the one who passes judgment and has power over them. Okay. And this is the God that you have with the Old Testament.
Okay, so that's what everybody then believes in, is this one God, and then these other gods, these Elohim, these other ones who fell, people then mistaken for what they call angels.
Right.
Yes? Okay.
And where they weren't angels at all. Angels were a totally different kind of being.
Oh, okay.
So, now it's interesting where I was talking about how God was saying, they've eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's a couple of points in here that I want to bring up. The first point that really threw me for a while, until I saw this coming up in other versions of this story, was what did God have against humans having knowledge?
Right.
And I had a problem with that. And I said, why was it that the fall of mankind took place because man gained knowledge? The knowledge of good and evil. And then, if God is saying that he had to prevent the humans from eating of the tree of life, lest they become like gods, like them, the Elohim, does that say that then mankind has the ability to attain God's status? And God was preventing them from doing that? So these are the two big questions for me that come out of that little passage alone. And now, once again, you have to presuppose that there's some meat to this story, that there's something to it. And I used to believe that this was the only sole truth on the matter was the biblical account, until I started looking into other things. And then I actually find myself praying and saying, God, throw me a bone here, because this doesn't look like what I was taught. And this is not the God I learned existed. And the writing of this book really did something for me that you can call this either good or bad. But what it did for me was it made me totally change my conception of who God is and what God is. And he's not the same God I went in writing about, even though I had questioned these things for years. And by the way, on this whole questioning thing, the late Richard Feynman, he is a quantum physicist. He worked with, he was a contemporary of Oppenheimer and Einstein. And so the late Richard Feynman, I was listening to something he said, and he said, for me, he said, there are many things I don't know. And he says, there's many things I do know. There's many things I don't know. There's a whole lot of things I don't know a thing about. He says, and this is why I ask. He says, but my asking starts when I doubt something. He says, when I doubt, I ask. And he says, and when I doubt and ask, it becomes that much harder for me to believe in something dogmatically. And that's kind of where I've ended up with some of this. The more I doubt certain versions of this, the more I ask questions about it. The more questions I ask, the more I dig for answers. And the more things I find, the more I find that the thing I started out with is not exactly so. And so it changes my belief system. I want to talk for just a minute about the ancient Sumerians. Now, when Moses wrote the book of Genesis and the first 5 books of the Bible, I don't believe there's any reason to doubt the historical efficacy of Moses. I take great pains in the book in a chapter to establish who Moses was, when he lived, and so on. But I believe Moses borrowed a lot of information. And I believe Moses, being the man who is writing the books, and many times writing the books about himself and who he is, I think Moses did what most men do. And I think Moses did what he needed to do to consolidate power, his hand of leadership over Israel, and also to establish religion. Now, Moses wrote in the 1400s BC. You go back about 3,000 more years to the Sumerian culture, the 4500s to the 4800s BC. And you look at the Sumerian culture, once considered to be the oldest civilization on the planet. The first written language was found in the Sumerian culture. The cuneiform texts, the tablets found in the Sumer-Akkadian texts, the Sumerian clay tablets, written in cuneiform. And they speak of their caste of gods as there's a mild reference to them being reptilian in nature, but that this caste of gods known as the Anunnaki were their gods who came from the stars and came to the earth. And when they did this, they found humans in a very wild, beastly, uncivilized form. And they, in a sense, bred them up. When you read this in the cuneiform tablets, you can't find any reference to genetic engineering or anything, but it's either they bred into them or they bred them up. But it says they took the wild beasts, the humans who were wild beasts of the fields, and they tamed them, and they enslaved them to do work for them, to till the ground for them, to till their gardens. Look at the comparison. What did God do when He created Adam and Eve? He put them in the garden to till and keep the garden. The Sumerian culture says that humanity was upbred by the Anunnaki to become their slave race, to till the fields for them, work the gardens, provide food, mine the natural resources, things like this. Now, the major god, or the superior god of the Anunnaki caste, was the god named Elil, E-L-I-L. Now, Elil is the superior god, but the etymology of his name is what's very interesting. The E-L in Elil is the same E-L found for the name of God in the Canaanite region, and eventually the Hebrew culture, in Elohim and El Shaddai and El Elyon. It's the same word that just evolved from the Sumerian Fertile Crescent area all the way up into the Canaanite, I almost said Canadian region, the Canaanite region over the next 3,000 years. So the name Elil, the superior god of the Anunnaki, is the same base word for the name El or El Shaddai, Elohim. It's the same God name. Now, Elil was the master god of this race of gods. His his brother was named Enki, also known as Ea in the Akkadian texts. Now, Enki Ea was the brother god of Elil, who saw the plight of the humans who he believed were abused and being enslaved, and he felt for them, and he broke away from his brother gods, and he stood as what could be described as the first freedom fighter for the humans. And what did he do? He set his base of operations in what was called in the Akkadian texts as the swampy, marshy backwaters of the Euphrates and Tigris River Valley there in the Fertile Crescent. And it was a place known as the Den of Serpents that he operated out of. And it was also known as his name, Ea. It was also known as Ea's Den, or Ea Den. And make the similarity to Eden of the garden in the Genesis story. So you've got now Enki Ea, who has broken away from the gods, freedom fighting. He teaches, get this, forbidden knowledges to the humans, breeds them up, and he, as a punishment for this, his brother god Elil condemns he and all his followers to the earth and to dwell in the subterranean caverns of the earth forever. And now you start looking at the Sumerian story of 3,000 years earlier than the Genesis story, and you start to see some of those gross similarities, how they all start to tie together. And what this did for me too was to say, wait a minute, what came first, the chicken or the egg here? Was the Genesis story the only true story, the only true God, when in fact it looks like Moses borrowed these names through an etymological evolution of language, that El and Ea became the gods who know. And by the way, where I said El was the base name for El in the Hebrew culture, the name Ea, Enki Ea is the same base word as YWH, which is Yahweh, or Jehovah in the Hebrew language. Jehovah is the Greek, I'm sorry, but Yahweh in the Hebrew. So the evolution of these words and these names and these gods, was that just a development of anthropology? Is that just an anthropological development? It's religion that mankind created, and so man kept borrowing religion from religion from religion. Much the way, if you look at the Catholic Church, when they started rising in the European territories, in what is now Europe, they took the old pagan name places, the old groves, and they cut down the pagan groves and they built cathedrals in their place. They took the pagan holidays and renamed them for Christian holidays. It was the Christianization of pagan Europe. Is that what we see in some of these cases? Is it just anthropological? Is it just historical? Is it just evolutionary? Or was there perhaps a proto-religion that existed at the beginning, and we're pulling all this information from that? If you've got all these cultures, and I've just cited only two, plus I threw in there the Celtic version of these characters, you've got a big story that took place that spans many different cultures. And by the way, when I keep talking about these forbidden knowledges that have been imparted by Enki Ea to the humans, by Krishna to the humans, by the Tuatha De Danann to the humans. I forgot to mention, even in this story in the Bible, the Nephilim, the sons of God coming down, impregnating human women, creating the Nephilim, is only a mere mention of the story until you go to the book of Enoch, an apocryphal book, kicked out of the Bible by the councils of Constantine because they deemed it to be non-scriptural. They could not come to unanimous consent, so it got placed in an apocryphal book. Well, in this book, where Enoch goes chapter after chapter after chapter about these beings, he calls the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, are known as the Watchers in his book. And the Watchers come down and impregnate human women. But the big sin that they commit is not just the impregnation of humans, because it says they chose whomever they desired, and they cohabited with them, they married them. I would dare say they loved them, and they bequeathed this race. But it said they also brought, if they were doing something evil, why were they bringing these knowledges to human? They were teaching the human civilization. They taught them agriculture. They taught them the signs of the sun, moon, and stars. They taught them herbology and the use of herbs as medicinals. They taught them cosmetics, the making of mirrors, cosmology. They taught them the making of edged weapons and how to forge metal. All of these were considered to be the knowledges taught to the humans by the sons of God, or the Watchers who came down.
Scott, can I ask you, so there is a bloodline of these Nephilim then?
Yes.
There is a bloodline. And
I believe it still exists today.
It still exists today. Now, I was looking at some YouTube channels, and they were talking about Nephilim being giants. You're talking about the same thing? They're giants?
I'm talking about the same thing now. The sad thing is that the word for giant was misinterpreted in the King James Bible. If you look at the King James Bible, it talks about there were giants in the earth, it says. Now, the only reference to giant is not from the word Nephilim. It was a mistranslation of the word. There are 3 or 4 different words that look almost identical to the word Nephilim, and you really have to know the difference between your Hebrew and your Aramaic to separate Nephilim from Nephilim, and so on. There's words like that. And the word used in the Genesis text is Nephilim, which means those who fell, those who came down, those who left an estate and came to another place. And this is the Nephilim. And keep in mind too, the Nephilim are not the beings who came down themselves. The Nephilim are only the offspring.
They're the offspring. But so I want to go back to what you were saying about the Sumerian, that basically the evil that was committed was teaching humans how to survive, how to go beyond where they were. And that's because then the gods, the bright shiny ones, were afraid that the humans would then figure out, well, I don't have to follow this. I can be as evolved.
Yes.
Is that the evil that was going on?
That's the evil that was going on. I think the corruption that was brought to man was the tainted bloodline. This is why the flood took place. This is why Noah was the pure-blooded one. And the sin that was committed by these beings who came down, in all cases, the sin that was committed was the teaching of forbidden knowledge. And
which was to make humanity better.
It was to make humanity better. But you go to the Anunnaki story, the Sumerian culture, it was used to make humanity better, but in reaction to being enslaved by the caste of gods. And so while it was meant to make them better, it angered the rest of the gods because it was freeing those slaves. It angered Ea to free them. And he freed them by teaching them knowledge and breeding them up. If you look at the Genesis story again, God set Adam and Eve in the garden to till the garden, to keep the garden for him. And when they learned something, when they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and fell, they gained knowledge. God said, let's not let them gain more knowledge so they become like us. And so they cast them out of paradise.
Right.
And so there's something about this imparting of knowledge. Even Krishna, as I mentioned, Krishna was executed for imparting knowledge to humans. That was considered forbidden knowledges. And he did it sitting on the back of a coiled snake under the banyan tree in a garden. You've got Quetzalcoatl, the god of the Mayans, the winged serpent god, the feathered serpent god of the Mayans. He also taught forbidden knowledges to the people and was executed by the other gods for this. And so you see this theme repeated over and over and over again. And if I go out looking for the answers, saying I am purely only Judeo-Christian in my outreach and my research, I'm going to taint my research. I've got to step outside the box for a minute and look at it. And when I do that, I find that the Hebrew story is just another version of everything else that's going on. And for me, there's no way to know which one is really true, other than by faith. And faith is all I've got, to accept that something is true. But then sometimes to believe by faith, you have to ignore fact to believe in faith. And,
right.
And that's what gives me a pause and creates problems for me.
So because of time frame, can we you've gone into the biblical part, which is extremely fascinating. Can we go into the alien part now?
Sure. Now, what all of this does, and I didn't spend a lot of, you'll notice in the book, I didn't spend an awful lot of time on the alien part.
No, but it kind of plays into now, I think, what's going on in the world now.
It does. I believe there is an ancient alien connection. Now, this is not a new thought to your listeners or to anybody out there, but the idea that ancient mankind may have interpreted what they saw as divine is, I think, the huge possibility here. That ancient mankind encountered non-human intelligences, and he attributed to these non-human intelligences the titles of gods, angels, devils, demons, everything in between. And again, this is looking at it purely to just look for the facts, not to dissuade anyone from believing something by faith. And so, if you have these ancient beings who descended down to mankind and imparted knowledge, the big question is, who were they? And where did they come from? Now, there's all kinds of mounting evidences that speak to ancient alien races being here, ancient alien entities being here. An anthropologist may look at those evidences, or an archaeologist, and poo-poo them and say, well, that's just this, or it's just that. It's just a cave drawing of a man in a big headdress, not a helmet. You see those kinds of things. But you find there are strange things that you will find in ancient cultures. And I bring this up in the book. It's very interesting. When you look at the book of Enoch, speaking about the Watchers coming down to earth, it says that there were 200 of them that came down and descended to the slopes of Mount Hermon. Or in the passage, it says Mount Armon, which is the same as Mount Hermon in northern Israel. And Mount Hermon is a mountain that sits there, it's still there today, obviously. It's a three-peaked mountain that straddles the Golan Heights today, highly politicized area, covering the borders of Syria and Lebanon in northern Israel. Now, this is the mountain where it says the Nephilim, the sons of God, the Watchers, came down and made a pact to go into human women and teach forbidden knowledges and impregnate them and cohabit with them. Now, this mountain sits on the 33rd parallel north of the equator in northern Israel. Now, 33, if you want to look at it numerologically, 33 is the number of enlightenment. And so sitting on the 33rd parallel north is Mount Hermon. Now, if you trace the 33rd parallel in a straight line all the way around the globe to the exact geo-global opposite spot on the 33rd parallel, you know where you end up? You end up at the crash site of Roswell, New Mexico. Now, we all look at that and go, wow, that's crazy. And the first thing I heard when I heard that was, what the hell does that mean? Is it just some geo-global coincidence? Or is there something to that? Then you start looking at what you could call ley lines, or the grid, that's this invisible grid that surrounds the earth, and you will start finding that all of these ancient religious sites connected to all these gods we've talked about, in all these different cultures, they all line up on a grid. You will find that someplace in South America or Central America lines up, and I can't name them all off the top of my head, but there are straight lines through the center of the earth where they connect to something in Asia, or something in the Middle East, or there is a line that goes from the Giza Plateau all the way through the spot of the Oracle of Delphi and Thebes, all the way straight again to 4 settlements in the north of Scandinavian countries. And these things line up for a reason. We don't understand why, because nobody's left that record. But the big question is this: why are they lining up? Who taught all these ancient civilizations to line these things up geoglobally? So something exists. I talked to Bill Burns, formerly of UFO Hunters, and now he's on, you see him more often on the H2, the History Channel's Ancient Aliens.
Oh, right.
And he talked about the 33rd parallel. He says, I believe these are just way lines for what you could call, he says, it sounds silly to say it this way, but for UFO traffic. They were guidelines to give people these ancient alien races from one place to another. Now again, while this might sound kind of fanciful or a bit, wow, that's kind of whack fringe, Scotty, just keep in mind, how different is that than saying God created man and woman out of the dust of the ground and breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and there was a snake character that tempted them in the fall of man. How different is any of this from any of the other religious stories we have, other than it's another version of these kinds of events? And I think it's an explanation. Does this do away with God or the need for God? Not necessarily. I think that they can be mutually coexistent, but I think it changes the nature of who they are. I believe that what you've got happening here with these sons of God coming down, these Tuatha De Danann coming down, these watchers who came down. And by the way, the job of the watchers was to circle the planet, orbit the planet, and keep watch over humankind. And they broke from their duties and came down and impregnated, intermingled, fraternized with them. And then you've got the Sumerian culture where the star gods came down and impregnated and bred up humans. You've got the African Dogon who talk about the half-fish, half-man creatures who came to Earth from a star system that in the 1920s, when two anthropologists interviewed some of these witch doctors from the Dogon, they talked about a star system and mapped it out, and we didn't even know that star system existed yet until many decades later. You've got also in the Sumerian culture, you have Berosus of Babylon, who talks about how the Anunnaki, or the ancient Sumerians, also had a race of gods, and the god was named Oannes, half fish, half man, who would rise up out of the Persian Gulf during the daytime, and he and his people would teach civilization to the ancient Sumerians, and they would go back to the sea. And so you've got all of this stuff going on. And you say, is it all different religions? Is that possible? Is it a single source? Are there different races that exist? And then you start getting into things that are happening more nowadays. We ask the question, do these bloodlines still exist today? And I believe, yes, they do. Can we trace them? Not necessarily. I think that's the hard task. There was in the discovery of the RH factor in human blood made in the 1950s, this was something that had never existed before. And it's something that they said this factor of the blood cannot be sourced in any source point in anything on Earth, genetically speaking. And it's still that way today. There is speculation, is this something of that Nephilim bloodline? There is also the guys like, if you've not heard of him, a guy named David Icke, who has quite a large movement. You look up David Icke, I-C-K-E, online, and this is a guy who used to be a soccer player for Great Britain and a sportscaster, and then he got into all these teachings of Zecharia Sitchin about the Anunnaki and the alien element involved. And he is a big purporter of an alien race, a reptilian race that actually lives and breathes and dwells amongst humans, and has since the beginning of time, and that they're the race that is looking to re-enslave or re-subjugate humanity.
Right.
And if you've heard of the Illuminati, he's saying these are characters that are behind the scenes, behind the Illuminati, behind things like this, and that they govern things to this day. And it's very interesting that I make this connection here. I was talking to John Zappis, who is a demonologist that maybe many people in your audience may know who John Zappis is. Yeah. And in interviewing him several months, almost a year ago now, I was asking him about demonic influence, and I said, do you think this influences the leaders of our world today? And he paused and he said, absolutely yes.
Yeah.
And he said, I can tell you example after example where this is very true. Now, what's very interesting about that is if you look at my book, and I believe it's on, because I was just talking to somebody about this today, that's why it's in my mind. I believe it's page 221 in my book. I'm referencing the demonic and the things that we might see in the paranormal community, or the paranormal field when we encounter the demonic. And might I say, I just have to throw this in, I bristle and wish I had a nickel for every time somebody said to me, I'm a demonologist. And I go, wait a minute, what do you know about demonology? Do you know, and pardon the pun, do you know what the hell you're getting into when you study demonology, when you make contact with these things? Because you're looking at guys like Zappis who talks about some of these beings and some of the facts that they work behind the scenes in governments. This ain't the stuff of TV, folks. It ain't the stuff of the movies. It ain't the stuff of comic books. If you're dealing with entities that truly indeed have some kind of power over us, you're not dealing with something that should be trifled with. And the only reason you are probably now wiped out of existence is because they don't care about you. And so you have to be very careful what you get involved in. Call yourself a demonologist very lightly. A demonologist is not like a side job. You know, I've got my job at the office during the day, but at night I am demonologist. You know, when you say that, you're belittling what it is. A demonologist is, if you go into, say, even the Roman Catholic version of this, any kind of religious or spiritual version, it's a calling. It is a way of life. It is something that governs and takes over your life, the rest of your life, and that is all you can do. We used to talk about that when I was in seminary. How do you define a calling? You can't do anything else other than that thing you're called to do. And if there is a calling, that's on the spiritual level. But I believe that there is something to this race that exists, and that it's behind the scenes. And while I don't adhere to everything Zechariah Sitchin wrote, or I certainly don't adhere to everything David Icke stands for, because I believe he comes across very much to me like a neo-Nazi and an anti-Semite, because he goes into the whole Merovingian bloodline thing, the whole Grail bloodline, the whole thing that Hitler was looking for with the Aryan bloodlines, and that was this pure bloodline. And they've taken it to a different degree, I think, and he's politicized it. But I believe that there's a race that exists there, and that there's something that's going on behind the scenes. And if you look at Enoch, get back to page 221 of my book, I think that's the page number. There's a passage from the book of Enoch that talks about how the spirits of the Nephilim, since they were born on the earth in the flesh, they will remain on the earth in spirit form. And that the evil they did to mankind during their lives, they will continue to do in spirit form. They will be the evil spirits that plagued mankind throughout time. And it's as though they hunger and thirst. They will have no way to satiate that hunger and thirst. And they will seek it, and they will seek to destroy, and they will be the evil amongst us. So in one respect, I think the Nephilim exist amongst mankind today in the form of evil, spirits. Perhaps even in the form of an evil race that wants to subjugate us. Again, it's all speculative because there's no way to prove one damn iota of any of it.
So are you talking about literal spirits? Are they in a spirit form, or are they in a body, in a alien body, in whatever body?
According to the Book of Enoch, they're in spirit form.
Okay.
But if they are spirit form as we understand demonics, they can certainly inhabit bodies. But I also believe that there is a remnant of Nephilim bloodline. And remember, the flood was supposed to be a thing that God wiped them all out?
Right.
That was the purpose of the flood. By the way, if you walk away from the flood story of Noah and the ark from this conversation and say, well, I believe it was the wickedness of mankind that caused the flood, that's what the English Bible kind of said without really getting into the meat of it. When you dig into the passage you find in the Hebrew, it was the wickedness of mankind was the corruption brought to mankind by the tainted bloodline of the Nephilim, and that God was going to wipe out this hybrid race with the flood, and Noah was the only pure-blooded man left, pure in all his generations back to Adam. So when you look at it in that respect, the flood was supposed to wipe out the Nephilim. Yet even in the passage in Genesis, and I believe this was added into the text afterwards, as a lot of things were, it says, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. And because right after the Exodus, you find Moses sends out the 12 spies into the land of Canaan, the promised land, and they come back reporting that we can't go in there. The inhabitants are the children of Anak, the Nephilim. They are huge in our eyes. They make us look like grasshoppers in their size. And I think it was just metaphoric. It was the term they were using, exaggeration. You also have, though, the big story of David and Goliath. And a very famous story in the Old Testament. But it says that Goliath and his 3 brothers were from the city of Gath in the Philistine area, and that they were called the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, the king. You know, Anak was the king of the Nephilim in the 5 city regions in what would now be the Dead Sea region. And so they say that the Nephilim existed in those cases. And Goliath, according to the biblical measurement, was 6 cubits in a span, which was roughly 9'2" to 9'4", right in that height. And it says he was here's a key reference. It says he was a man of valor from the days of his youth, a mighty warrior, a man of valor. Now, if you go back to the Nephilim story, it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and they were also known as the heroes of old and the men of renown, the mighty men of valor. And these were the Gibborim in the Hebrew sense, a caste of people known as the Gibborim, who were said to be the giant, mighty men of valor, the great warriors of their time, the heroes of old.
So they weren't literally giants. It was more of their power. Maybe their power made them seem bigger than life.
That's exactly what I believe it was.
Okay.
I believe they may have been a little bigger than most people. They called Goliath a giant. He was 9 foot tall.
Okay.
So I think there might have been something to that, and there's lots of legends and mythologies of giants down through the ages.
Right.
But King Og, one of the kings of that 5 city region, they said that in the Old Testament that his bed measured something like 15 feet long. And now I don't know if the guy was just a short guy with a Napoleonic complex and wanted a big bed, or if he was really a giant, for sure.
Now, do you have a lot of questions?
Well, they've been asking questions through chat.
Okay, so what we'd like to do, our listeners, I'm sure have tons of questions. They've been asking questions through chat. So why don't we take one right now? Norene's going to look it up. So do you think, as she's looking, do you think then the Nephilim were able to leave this earth? If the flood covered the earth, did they go underground? Did they fly back home? Did they go back?
I think that they left and returned.
Okay, yeah.
I think you see all through, I think some were still here, as you had in the Sumerian culture. They were condemned to the caverns of the earth, the subterranean caverns of the earth. But I think you also see all through time, all through the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance period, you hear of all these visitations, call them demonic, incubus, succubus, impregnations, all these mystical characters you find, and then get to just our most recent generation. Look at the last 40 years of alien abduction, people claiming impregnations and fetuses stolen and things like that.
Right.
Remember, there was a prophecy that even Jesus himself gave in the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. He said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be again at the time of the coming of the Son of Man, which was code language for the end times. Bible speak for the end times. And so, what was it like in the days of Noah? There were races coming in and impregnating humans,
right.
Creating off-breed races, hybrid off-breeds. And I think this has gone on through the ages.
And I think, I a lot of times speak to people when I hear people are just abducted, that humanity needs to start waking up to this information. That we are just slaves and we're being used. And I think, as long as people stay asleep and not realize what's going on and that this is going on today, that it'll continue. And it is getting worse, and it is, we're getting all this information now that's coming to us from you, from others, that, there's a big thing coming. And another guest we had on said they're talking about thinning the population. You know, it's gotten too much. The humans have gotten too out of control, have breeded, you know, like rats and bunnies, and they need to now bring down the masses, and that's where the Illuminati come in and all of this. So did you find a question?
Yeah, I have,
okay, we have a question.
Well, I can't, it's from Joey, and Joey was asking about the pyramids, the Mayans and the Chinese and other races. How could they have built the pyramids when they were these peoples were so far apart?
Well, and there's the big question. Now, I don't address that directly in my book, but here's a question. The first thing you want to ask is, are we saying that mankind needed help to build these things, and mankind did not have the intelligence or the ingenuity or the ability to mastermind some of these kinds of projects? I think they could, but what we're finding is that masterminding the project didn't necessarily mean we can explain how they did it, because you can't explain some of these things away by even modern technology. And so, was there outside help? Perhaps. I was talking to Philip Coppens not long ago, and he was talking about the study of the polymers used in the mortars on the pyramids, and that these polymers were synthetic substances that could not have been produced by the technology that existed at the time the pyramids were built. There were actually polymers, plastics, that were embedded into or part of the process of making the mortar. And so you've got features like that. I can't speak to this in great detail, but what I can tell you is that every culture having its own version of a pyramid, having its own version of statuary, its own version of snakes and things like this that permeate every culture, you're looking at something that was widespread. And when these cultures did not have a lot of contact with each other, and no contact at all, how did they end up building the same kinds of things, and in such global opposite spots and on same grid lines and things like this? That's the big question.
Well, I was searching today some information, and there was a fella, William Joyce, I believe it, from Britain, that it was 8 foot tall, and they said that he could lift 2,000 pounds. So if some of these giants were all over worldwide, couldn't they have lifted or helped build the pyramid?
Sure, why not? And of course, it's speculation. We don't know any of these answers for sure. It's like when you look at the Tuatha De Danann and the Celtic legends, the bright shining giant kings from heaven. They were the elven folk, and who were the elven folk? You look, I think Tolkien had a good, keen view as to what these beings were when he wrote about them in his fictions, because the elven folk were these tall, glowing, elegant characters, and so you've got giants mentioned all over the earth. And by giants, we don't necessarily have to be 36 feet tall and eat 300 goats a day to satiate their appetite, which is what sometimes the Book of Enoch says, things like that.
And I think people back when you're talking about were much shorter. You know, they were people used to be much smaller than they are now. So somebody my size, a woman my size, could be totally, and I'm 5'8.5", could totally be considered a giant.
Sure.
So I'm a giant.
Okay, I have another question.
Some guys I know.
Yeah.
You're a giant compared to me. Okay. Oh gosh, I just lost it.
Can you get the gist of it?
Yeah, James is asking. Oh God. Okay, wait a minute. I had it and it keeps jumping because people. Okay, it's coming. I know it's coming. Come on. Oh darn. He was asking about man, Adam and Eve. Why didn't they just make one one sex? Why did they
do a man and a woman?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a question I've had before. Why was there a gender? Why were there genders? I don't think. Now, if God created the genders in the book of Genesis, that's the way He chose to do things. I don't know why. If it was a race that came here and bred them up, it was certainly, they just took what existed. If humanity is a form of life on this planet, most life has genders. unless you start getting amoebic life and things like that, some amphibian life. They can cross over, so to speak.
So do you then think that humanity was already here before these gods showed up, before the aliens showed up, that they came from the primordial ooze and kind of evolved into who they were?
I think that, well, according to the Anunnaki, or the Sumerian legend, the Anunnaki came and the humans were as the wild beasts of the field, and they tamed them and bred them up. In the Genesis story, you have God forming Adam out of the dust of the ground.
Right.
In the Lakota version, you have the first man and woman ascending out of the subterranean depths of the earth and seeing the sunlight for the first time, and that was creation. And Iktopi was the trickster character who impregnated the daughter of the woman and had multiple births. And so as far as creation goes, the genders, I don't know. There's a lot of these questions that all this stuff does is raise more questions. And there's a lot of questions where there aren't distinct answers.
But I think people need to start, like you started from a very, very boxed in kind of religious upbringing, and you started thinking, no, this does not fit for me, this doesn't resonate in my being. So it's people starting to question what does not fit. It doesn't make sense, you know, and going beyond what they've been taught just because they go to church, they're taught this, that it must be true. You need to start looking beyond to know what's going on in this world and why is this world falling apart?
Well, it's like I used to say when I was a youth pastor. I used to tell my kids, what makes you a Christian, or what makes you believe what you believe? I said I could stand in a garage all day and never turn into a car. So it's something that I do by volition. It's something I choose to do. And I have a problem with, there's some things you mentioned, which is why I'm getting to this. I have a big problem with people who will come to me and say, oh, I feel that it's this way. I feel spirit is doing this and doing that. And it's like, my reaction, I mock it a little bit, only because I say, my reaction is one to say, well, that's great for you. If you feel that, then go by what you feel by all means. But I cannot operate in a world of fact based on my feelings alone. I need to know something. I need to know why things are and why they exist. And that was one of my reasons for digging into all of this stuff. I'd been taught something, and I was told I had to believe that by faith, and I felt I was on the right path at one time, but something just didn't resonate. It wasn't true. It didn't seem right. There had to be more. There's more to this than what's on the surface.
That's for sure.
And so I started digging.
Now, what's all these skeletons that they're finding all over? Is that for real?
A lot of these pictures you see on the internet are nothing but fraudulent, photoshopped or tampered photos. Where you see the little Arab guys, you know, with the shovels, and they're standing by a pit with a skull that's obviously 8 feet long. That just doesn't, it's not real. Almost every one of those photos has been discredited. Now, there are skulls that exist. I don't know which museum it is, and I've said this before already, and I gotta look up which museum it's in. I don't know if it's the Jerusalem Museum or if it's the Berlin Museum. I don't know which one, but they've got skulls that have the elongated skulls that are kind of like the. There's a difference between skulls that have been boarded, obviously, and manipulated physically, versus skulls that have a different growth pattern to them. And some of these skulls exist and they're big. They're bigger than the humans. They don't know what to do with them. They don't know where they get there, and they're not on public display. But they exist, and there are good people who know they exist, credentialed people. And they don't hide them away. They just don't talk to them. They're just not on display. They don't know how to display them. So there was some talk today. I heard from somebody asking, did you hear about the big monolithic characters on Easter Island that they've done excavating and finding? Some of these aren't just heads, they're whole bodies buried in the earth, and beneath them they found some of these elongated skulls. I said, you know, that's a story I don't know anything about. I've never saw that. I'm going to have to look that up. So if there's all these kinds of finds all the time. The only problem you have to deal with, it's like in the paranormal world. It's like people putting out faked photos of ghosts.
Right.
And it's like, I always wonder, why are you doing that? You're doing that. I had a friend who was a skeptic and died in the wool skeptic, had done some paranormal investigating with me, and had actually seen things and heard things. Sat there with me in his own editing studio listening to EVPs and looking at me and going, he said, God, I can't explain that one away. And he was truly shaken up a bit. And yet later, he created, a couple of years later, he created a film. There was supposed to be a time lapse of the toys in his kids' playroom in the basement at night by night vision, and how they moved across the room and the shadows formed and things like that. Well, he put this up on the internet, on the social networks, and he confided in me that this was a film that, well, first he asked my opinion of it, and he wanted everybody to comment on it. What do you think of this film I caught in my basement the other night? And of course, everybody's commenting on it. And my first response to him was, I looked at it and I said, well, gosh, the oval shape of the shadow around your image just says to me that it's a fake shadow. I said, this isn't even real night vision. I said, this has been tampered with. I said, you created this to run a test, didn't you? There's so many wrong patterns of light. And this guy went out there and did this thing to try to fool people. Now, it's for a purpose on his end, but I don't know why people put these photos out there. I don't know why people do that, unless it's just for a joke or it's just for whatever, and it gets taken totally out of context. But there's so many fake photos out there of ghosts, of Nephilim skeletons and things like this. I just don't think there's any of them that are any real.
Yeah.
If they look at it and apply the old axiom, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is.
James wants to know, how do spirits work into your thinking?
Ghosts?
Yeah, I think he means ghosts.
Do you believe in ghosts? I think he wants to know your thoughts.
I've encountered ghosts in my time. Maybe not everybody knows that I used to work for the Ghost Hunters with Taps Paramag. I was the editor-in-chief of Taps Paramagazine for about a year and a half. And so I did some traveling to all these events with them, and I led investigations at these events. And I've been doing this for 12 years, off and on. And I've seen things. I like to say to people, I was always a believing skeptic, but it wasn't until I really started getting into it where I was touched, slapped, pushed, had my ear whispered in, communicated with things on boxes that interactively communicated with me. I've seen apparitions, full facial apparitions. I've seen things. And I'm no longer a skeptic. I've seen too much. But all of my evidence is anecdotal evidence, according to the skeptic. Well, I have a good skeptic of mine who was a friend of mine for 20 years who said, I told him about this face that I saw, and then an EVP would be picked up. And they went along with it. And about 13 minutes of EVPs. And it wasn't very nice. It was pretty foul language he was using with this. And I thought that made it kind of funny. That I've got a ghost swearing at me. And now, is this a show that's governed by the FCC? Am I allowed to utter 4-letter words? Or do I have to keep it clean?
You have to keep it clean.
All right. We had this, I saw a face. It was in the dark, and the only reason I saw the face is the little glow off the night vision of my cameraman. And I was looking back at him, and there was a man's face over his shoulder looking at me. And I could see every detail of the face, but it lasted a split second. By the time I said face, and he turned the camera, of course, the thing's gone. But we got EVPs right after that were cussing us out. I was asking, could you tell us who you are? And we got F you both. Then we'd sit there, and of course we weren't hearing this live. We heard it when we played it back. And then I said something like, can you tell us why you're here? No. Can you tell us what your name is? No. And can you tell us this and that? No. It would give answers just like this sounded like that, like no. And then my friend said, we've got all this equipment, we can record you for posterity. Would you like to speak to us? And the voice goes, ooh. Just like that. And then it went into a couple of other F-off. And it kept doing that. It kept saying, I'd say, we'll give you one more try, F-off. And, that's what it was saying to us. And I've got this all recorded. And it was a crazy bit. And to me, it seemed almost like there's that sense of humor. It was almost like a George Carlin grumpy type of ghost or something. Awesome. F-off. And so I have encountered ghosts, yeah. Can I tell ghost is? No, not necessarily. I think if we take a ghost by traditional definition, it's the spirit of a once corporeal person that's either trapped here or remaining here of its own free will, or it's being kept here by something else. And but not everything we think is a ghost could necessarily be a ghost. What if we're communicating with interdimensional characters?
Right.
What if I sat on I have an original Frank's box. It was given to me by Frank Sumption, and I was sitting on this thing with my then 16-year-old daughter just a few years ago, and we got the voice of somebody that said it was my aunt, and my aunt, who had passed away in '95 at a relatively young age. She was 45 when she passed away rather suddenly, and she brought up saying who she was. This is Andy. It kept saying on this box. And my daughter said, "Do you remember who I am? I was 3 when you died." And the voice said, "I see you there. You're pretty now." And then the voice asked me out of the blue, just out of the blue, it says, "Where is Janie?" Now, Janie was my mom, her sister. And so I had a voice asking me for somebody, and by name. And so that was one of those odd things. Now, I've also had people with that box get entities that will say, "Adjust your frequency to thus and so I can hear you better." Now, is that a ghost? Does a ghost need to tell you to adjust the frequency on your equipment?
Right.
Or is that somebody else? Is that something interdimensional?
Right.
What are we talking to at that point?
Right.
Who are we communicating with?
I think that's where a lot of
the great danger for me with all of this stuff, this communication, is that while it's curious and we're trying to learn something, I think there's a danger because you don't always know what you're opening up to. You always don't know who is on the other end.
And I think that's I totally agree with you 100%. I've been doing this so long with ghosts and all that, but it's not always ghosts. And I think people just go on face value that they're talking to who they think they are. You know,
Right.
there's an easy way to read a human mind. It's super simple. I've been told that, and yet people just go by what they hear or what they, see, and they don't investigate beyond that, and that is
Right.
dangerous. So we're running out of time. Can you? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So where can people buy your book, your website?
Okay.
Where can people reach you?
Okay. Well, you can. The book is everywhere. It's out through New Page Books. You can find it in all the bookstores. Barnes and Noble, I know, carries it. A lot of your smaller bookstores will carry it. You can find it on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. If you go to my website, my magazine site, IntrepidMag.com, you can find a link to it there. And if I can mention too, one of the big things coming up, if
Yes.
you really like this kind of stuff and you want to find out more about it through my magazine, Intrepid Mag, we're putting on a big conference in October, the 18th through the 21st here in Minneapolis. And the people that we have speaking at this event are people like Eric Von Daniken, who wrote Chariots of the Gods 40-some years ago. This is his first American appearance in almost 10 years. We've got George Norrie from Coast to Coast. From the History Channel H2 show, Ancient Aliens, we have Bill Burns, Philip Coppens, Giorgio Tsoukalis. We have Ian Punnett, who did the weekend Coast to Coast. We have 10 other authors that you'd recognize. Laird Scranton, Marie D. Jones, Larry Flaxman, Nick Radfern, Dr. John Ward, a friend of mine who's an archaeologist, anthropologist in Egypt, that's coming to speak on symbolism and how it ties in to the ancient Egyptian symbolism, to the Cathars and the Knights Templar. We have Dan Madsen, who is the publisher of all the Star Trek magazines, Lord of the Rings magazines, Lucasfilms magazines, and his take on all of this stuff and his business story. We have, and I don't want to miss anybody, we have John Ventry from MUFON is going to be speaking there as well. So we have a host of amazing speakers. And if you'd like to come in and visit us at this symposium, we'd love to have you. It's all this kind of talk, all this kind of topic.
Awesome.
Dealing with ancient aliens, anthropology, archaeology, cosmology, as it all ties in together in all of this stuff. Just go to intrepidmag.com.
Can you spell that, please? People want to.
Sure. Sure. Just got a frog in my throat. Sorry. Intrepidmag.com. Intrepid, INTREPID REPID, intrepidmag.com.
Awesome.
You can click on the Paradigm Symposium link at the top of the page there. And by the way, tickets are moving. So if you want to come to this thing, take a look and see. And if you're interested, I'd move pretty soon.
And that's in October, yes?
That's in October. It's 6 months from now.
Wonderful.
You can also just go directly to Paradigm Symposium, but that's harder to spell.
That is.
So
Wonderful.
So there you go. There's everything I know.
That was a
Wow.
lot.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm enjoying your book immensely. I'm going to now slow down and really take in what I'm reading instead of trying in one day to read. Don't do that. But it's a fabulous book.
I am working on the continuation of this book now. New Page Books is asking to write the follow-up, which is entitled "The Secret History of the Reptilians."
Oh my God.
And it's subtitled "The Pervasive Presence of the Serpent Throughout Human History, Religion, and Alien Mythos."
Wow. So when we be finished with that book, you'll have to come back.
My manuscript is due July 16th.
Oh my God.
Oh.
I've got a busy few weeks ahead of me, and it's due for a February release, February 20th.
So next.
So we're all obviously assuming we're still going to be here in 2013.
Yes, yes,
Hope so.
we will. We will. Maybe not the same way, but we'll be here. Some of us.
Well, thanks, Scott.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thanks
being
for
our
having me.
guest.
I'm sorry I was late again, but thanks for having me in.
You made it, and we really enjoyed having you.
We did. I learned a lot.
And to the viewers, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you did learn some things as well. He's fascinating, and it's Scott's opinion. You know, I mean, you don't have to believe it. Everybody has their own, and he, you know, didn't want to get involved in anybody's religious beliefs. But it's just a show that we wanted to bring to you. So we hope you enjoyed it. We certainly did.
I loved it.
And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And Scott, thank you so much. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Good night. Blessings.